Hey, we'll let people assemble, start recording attendance. We share. Out of curiosity, whose Dent project? I mean, you're welcome to participate, whoever you are. I'm just curious.
Oh no, that's it's me, Sridhar, by
Oh.
mistake. Let me log out and log in as Sridhar.
No, it's okay. You can stay as Dent project if you want. I just never heard of Dent project. Is that a Linux Foundation thing, Sridhar?
Correct. It's very similar to Sonic, but it's ONL based, switch dev based thing. But now they're working closely. How do we integrate Dent with Sci? Maybe we can discuss it. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, I don't.
Network operating system project. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't run across Dent as a project. I mean,
yeah, Joe, we looked at it a while back. You probably don't remember it.
No, don't remember it at all. I looked at I mean I know about O&L, but not I didn't realize it had gotten put into a Dent thing.
Yeah, no.
So you looked at it a while back. Cool.
I looked at it a while back. Yep.
And are you set for API today?
Yeah, good enough.
All right. That is okay. All right. So let's get rolling. 7:04, our usual start time. We've got a very good quorum. Anything else anyone wants to bring up for the agenda? Are there any approvals, review and approvals needed for anything? Is there anything coming up for review and approvals? Okay. Dan, next week, could we get a project update for IPDK and IPDK direction?
Yeah, that should be fine.
Is our sub project? Okay, so we'll do that. We'll do this one on the, what date is that exactly? The 3rd? Okay, so. All right, any other future topics or agenda items that people want for a future meeting? If you don't have anything today, I mean, we'll do the API working group, and I suspect that's going to be an interesting discussion. But anything anyone wants for future other than what I have listed here in announcements?
Real quick lab update would be great.
Okay, Venkat, are you?
Well, not I'm more interested in what happened with what's going on with the
Oh, Sridhar.
I will
Yeah,
update.
Sridhar can do a lab update first. Sridhar, why don't you do that while people are thinking? And then when you're done with that, I'll see if anybody has any other agenda items or for either this meeting or an upcoming meeting. And then we'll drop into Mark's update and discussion.
Okay.
I also have one item, if it suits today. If it doesn't, then we can do it next week, which was to give an update on the Red Hat Echo project. I think you have it under announcements, so I'm not sure if you wanted it as a.
Yeah, no, I want it. So this
Okay.
is perfect. So Myron, why don't we have you do that as well? Perfect. And
Yeah, that'll be good because it kind of ties into some of the API work.
yeah, perfect. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Sridhar, while I'm typing. Real quick.
So in short, I should be we should be able to start lab activities from August 1st. So I requested to turn on the services from August 1st. Hopefully the signatures will get completed by this week, and we will start the engagement 1st of August. If no other last minute surprises from Hurricane, we should be starting our activities from 1st of August.
Perfect.
Any questions on that? So the lab is coming. Yeah, I guess I'd had a separate update, but lab is coming. All right. Miriam, why don't you go first? I will stop.
Sure.
I will stop and you can share.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, just let me know when you can see it. Oh, I think that pop-up means you can see it.
Yep, you're
Cool.
correct.
Great. So for folks who don't know, a few weeks ago, a colleague of mine, Donald, presented a project or a POC that we've been working on, which is called Extending Kernel Hardware Offloads. And the idea or the focus of that project is essentially looking at how we can integrate existing CNIs with OPI, which led us to look at a bunch of kernel hardware offload subsystems, including TC, NetFilter, SwitchDev, and the kernel notifier infrastructure. And what we kind of learned from looking at all of these subsystems was that if we want to integrate with existing CNIs, then we need to figure out mechanisms to reflect the messages from these subsystems to the DPU or the IPU, and you know, also to be able to reflect messages from the other way as well. So from the accelerator back up to the CNI and so on. And the vast majority of these subsystems actually involve netlink from a configuration point of view. Some don't, like the native kernel notifier, kind of the FDB notifier stuff happens completely under the hood in terms of, being able to view stuff from user space. It would be kind of relatively difficult. Some switch dev mechanisms also get triggered under the hood as well through the kernel and so on. And so we also need another mechanism to integrate into those kernel hardware offload subsystems. And the next thing that we also need is a mechanism to be able to reflect information like stats back from the accelerator, for example, for offloaded flows and so on and so forth. So because of that, we've kind of been working on a bunch of different components to kind of put the POC together, if that makes sense. So we've been working in the kernel on defining a bunch of netlink schemas for different different parts that we want, different agents that we want to use. So like for the oven K CNI, if we want to, for the oven CNI, if we want to use OVS and so on, then we need to have OVS flow information, and that's generally shared over Netlink. So we've been doing some work there to define some schemas. We've also been looking at building a Netlink agent that's going to monitor all of these messages from the kernel hardware subsystems and reflect them back up to user space. And so we've been extending a kernel tool as well called YNL to be able to support all the things that we need in terms of an agent. So at the moment it was supporting mainly generic Netlink, but we need to extend it to support Netlink raw. We need to extend it to support the behavior of an agent. So right now you kind of run it in a one-shot fashion and it'll get you some Netlink information, but obviously that'll have to change if you want to use it as an agent and so on. We were also working on and all of this work is kind of ongoing, and we're slowly upstreaming patches to the kernel. I can give very specific links to all of the patches if people are really interested. I have a link to our GitHub project, and I can share this after the meeting as well. We had a fully fledged POC ongoing regarding the kernel notifier subsystem. So all these changes that happen outside of the scope of Netlink, how can we intercept those messages and reflect them up to user space, and how can user space also send messages to the kernels, to the relevant kernel subsystems. We mainly settled on a mechanism using eBPF, and that required both infrastructural changes to the kernel as well as leveraging existing eBPF functionalities, like using the eBPF ring buff and so on to exchange messages from the kernel to user space. So we're in the process of kind of cleaning up all of the work around that in order to be able to upstream that. And lastly, we have been working on the stats piece. So how can we get the statistics back from the accelerator to the user space part of the CNIs? For example, if it's open vSwitch, then and a flow has been offloaded, how can we get those stats all the way back to OVS without having to go through the fully fledged driver development process? And again, we've been working on leveraging eBPF, and we've made some infrastructural changes to be able to support a new type of struct op for hardware offload to start off with. So, I guess it kind of looks like a bunch of little threads in progress at the moment, but we're hoping to be able to bring it all together to show, an alternative way for existing CNIs to be able to integrate with something like OPI without having to make any underlying changes to the CNI, So that's kind of what that's about and where it's at. And I guess if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or if people would like a better deep dive into what we're doing, we can certainly come back and do that.
Which CNIs are you targeting? What's the target use case that you're trying to?
Anything that's using a standard Linux subsystem. So at the moment we're looking at Oven, right? Oven K, and essentially, all of these mechanisms that we're integrating with are standard Linux-based ones. So if your CNI is doing any sort of hardware offload, then it's using either TC, NetFilter, or SwitchDev to do that, or your driver is fully integrated with the whole kernel notifier subsystem under the hood. So anything that's Linux-based, this should work with.
Okay, I think this is really well aligned. When I bring in IPDK next week, we use the Netlink, the kernel notifier system to do the integration for Calico, and we're just trying to come to the plan of how to make it work for Oven. So this is extremely interesting. Like this looks very promising. So yeah, thank you for the update.
And Anybody else have questions? So my only question here is, could you summarize and I don't know, maybe you could just make a slide and upload it for us, or put a summary as a text pull, you know, a markdown text pull request, which, and it'll get just approved because it's just a summary of what you're going to want in OPI. What do we need to open source and define to support this? So I think a summary of that would be good.
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I think that's the next step, right? So this at the moment is just to prove out that if we can create these kind of components, then potentially we have a way to integrate existing CNIs without having to make underlying changes with OPI. So at this moment in time, I can probably give a best guess as to what components we'd look at having an OPI and upstreaming. But again, I would say it's more of a best guess rather than a complete view till the POC is kind of finished, because we're discovering things as we go along.
Okay, so that's
Yeah.
fine. So
Yeah.
just claim it however you like, but having that summary, I think, would be extremely valuable, even if it's incomplete.
Okay.
Because you know, I think you know, a lot of people would definitely like to see, I see how you're gonna, to what pieces of this you want common across the DPUs and you want to open source to make all the things you talked about come true for everyone. Because,
Yeah.
and I think that would be extremely valuable, even if incomplete. And again, it isn't a, oh, here's the final plan, let's vote on it. This is a, here's a summary of where we are and where we're going relative to what we're gonna put into OPI when we're done. And any guess is better than no guess on this one.
Yeah, and I guess just to highlight, like, the reason why it's really a guesstimate more than anything else is because of dependency on things being accepted into the kernel, you know, which is a risk, I guess, more than anything. But I can highlight that as well.
Yeah, highlight the risk. And again, if we have, you know, if we need to go approach anyone to get things to happen, we can leverage the Linux Foundation to do that. So.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
I had one more question. Do you think that this could help Cilium be, if someone has Cilium as a CNI, do you think that this mechanism would tie in there, or are they too eBPF customized for this to help?
It's a good question. I guess if you were to use Cilium, you could leverage these some of the changes that we've done to I guess, okay, so Cilium kind of bypasses a lot of the mainstream kernel bits, which is why you get all that great acceleration, right? So some of the work that we've done here for being able to send notifications from the kernel to user space using BPF, you can certainly leverage in Cilium, and you can also leverage the mechanism going the other way from this kernel notifier subsystem. It might require some changes to Cilium, in that you would have to install additional BPF programs. So that's what I imagine the extension would be from the Cilium point of view. As long as the kernel supports all the other bits under the hood, Cilium won't really care, I don't think.
Yeah, it's really promising. Yeah, it's interesting. Cool.
Any other questions? All right. Mark, you're up.
Okay, I can give a verbal view of where things are at. I don't have anything prepared, so if that works. Or do you want something
yeah, or you
prepared?
can use the, you know, you can use the GitHub and the text files there if you want to illustrate it, you know, show anything.
Yeah, I can do that also. Yeah. So basically, a lot of the focus over the past few months has been around defining some of the networking view of the APIs. We have a really good view on storage. We've got a partial view around IPsec in terms of how you do strong swan. We've had requests come in to look at WireGuard as another option for IPsec. So that's another area that we have to start delving into. The primary areas that we've been looking at is, as Miriam just brought up, around the CNIs. We've had a lot of discussions around the CNI work and how that would tie in, what the pieces would be, which has brought up a view of we need to go back and probably take a look at NetLink as one of the options, see what the capabilities are in NetLink and how some of that would be appropriately exposed into the API framework. As everybody knows, the API is based around gRPC. So we're using gRPC and protobufs. We're going to be able to support redfish tie-ins, et cetera. Underneath of that, it would be the linkages that would go into the various APIs that are provided by the DPU vendors. So there'd be a translation layer that would fit all of that. And then of course you have to tie that in with the CNIs appropriately. So that's kind of a verbal view of the architecture. There's not a really good diagram that shows the CNIs and everything else right now, but of course, right off the top of my head, I can't find the other diagrams I wanted to put up.
Yeah. So I know there was a lot of discussion on the networking approach and which set of APIs to adopt, because trying to define yet again from scratch wholesale is a perilous journey that I don't think anyone's advocating, right? I mean, we could do it. I found my old diagrams from when we were doing Chinook for redfish, and have a complete alternate way of defining the structure, the overall structure of the models. But I don't think we should entertain that here. So the question is, where's the thinking and sentiment right now on the networking APIs?
So there's a lot of conflict. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. There is some conflict still going on around the networking APIs. We've got the contribution that Ericsson has put in around the EVPN. They don't want to move off of that at this particular moment in time because they've built an entire framework around that solution. One of the things that Boris and some of the others were doing in terms of implementation was to adapt the cloud APIs and try to extend or make them reach into the EVPN. But there was no give or take at this particular moment in time from Ericsson in terms of adjusting to that. We do have a planned working summit that will happen sometime in September. The date hasn't been chosen yet, but it's been requested to be put off till September to pull all of the different people together and start thinking about how we do consolidation around the different contributions that are there right now. One of the other pieces that we're trying to look at, and we haven't started it yet because we've still been talking about the EVPN API, but we're going to start looking at what use cases need to be there. We did put together a list of desired capabilities that we see the APIs need to have. And I can share that real quick. This was something that came up in some of the discussions that we had. So we listed out a list of must-have desired capabilities, which is really about how you provision VPCs, how you set up a VLAN, a VXLAN, BGP, EVPN, et cetera. And when you think about setting up VLANs, you have to look at it in terms of, is it an access VLAN or a trunk VLAN? Because you can have those actually terminate at the DPU, IPU system. We've got all the provisioning that has to happen for the virtual NIC. We've got the configuration of the physical ports. You have configuration of the logical ports that you create. There's stateful firewall, load balancer, etc. So that we put together this list of required capabilities. And then of course we have another list of really the application requirements. So these were contributed by some of the solution providers that they basically said, these are things that we see need to be in there in terms of capabilities. So this is where we need to focus on how we address this within the APIs. And we can continue to add to this set of capabilities that we require in there. So you can take a look at this on the GitHub, and if there's any questions, just go ahead and put them out there, because we want to continue to build this list up in terms of requirements that we need to meet. Questions? Yes, silence is good.
Is there any notion of defining a more abstract way of encapsulating VLANs and all their attachments, virtual routers and all their attachments, and then using the underlying models from wherever to configure the pieces of that? In other words, define a superstructure on which to hang the other models.
Okay, so I've been independently looking at, I haven't put it out there because I haven't finished fleshing it out. Let me see if I can pull it up here real fast. It'll probably take me a minute to get it up. But yeah, I took a look at what OpenConfig has to offer. Now, OpenConfig, unfortunately, is relatively convoluted in terms of its structure and its definition. And I say that tongue in cheek because it builds on all of the different Yang models, and then it takes those models and it does all sorts of inheritance and things like that, which you cannot do when you're defining a protobuf. It just does not work. So in terms of trying to create a structure that would allow you to pull in VLANs and such, you can build it around the interface construct and look at it from that standpoint, but then it starts to get relatively large. So you have to break it out into various pieces to do that. Trying to get this pulled up so you can see. Here we go. All right. So give me a second here.
So while Mark is pulling up that up, any other questions on API group? Because I know most of you participated in it. Those are good meetings, and it seems like progress is being made.
It's slow progress, but it is some progress being made.
And then, maybe it would be useful, because all this has been, was in public back when I did it. Would it be useful for you to see the illustrative example, the diagram of what I thought a top level model would be for a complete switch for Redfish before we abandon that?
That would be, it would add another data point to things.
Okay, let me share then and walk you guys through what I was saying back in the day. Okay, so this has a little bit of redfishese, which, you know, I'm rusty on, and some of you may not have never seen, but it's not hard to follow the gist of it, which is, it was, you know, it's one of these URL hierarchies with, anytime there's a pound sign, it means enumeration, basically means a list. And we had conceived of a switch as being a set of ACLs, a set of config blocks, a set of gateways, routers, bridges, interfaces, and ports. And it was fairly flat from the point of view of switch ownership, because when you tie them together, let me get the zoom so you guys can actually see this. When you tie them together, the core model of a switch is, I believe, is as follows. So what you have is routers as the central element, and you can have multiple of those. Those are in yellow, the yellow oval. And what they have is interfaces that hook to bridges. And bridges have interfaces which hook to the rest of the world, which inevitably hooks to another bridge, which inevitably hooks to another router on another device. And then you have gateways, and gateways are basically to tie interfaces together without routers. So, and that, you know, gateways where you're going to change protocols. Now, you could argue with me that a gateway could be viewed as a specialized kind of router. I broke it out deliberately. And the hierarchy, the attachment hierarchy, is from a logical point of view, is the switch has gateways, routers, and bridges, all of which have interfaces, all of which have ports. An interface and port distinction is the traditional switch vendor networking one, where the port is the physical thing, and it may have subports and all manner of constructs, physical constructs underneath. Or in fact, you know, you can have multi-protocol ports and fancy stuff from other areas. But, and then an interface is kind of a multi personality kind of thing. So it can be a lag, or effectively it can be just a direct interface, or it can be a VLAN interface. Or it could in fact be a tunnel VXLAN interface. So, and those are all interfaces. And then the notion of bridge is that's a VLAN. But remember, VLAN is a tag on the wire. Really, it's an L2 bridge that does packetting at using the MAC addresses. So this is how, and then everything in here can be decorated with ACLs, right? So the ACLs are a global pool, but they're bound to interfaces, bridges, gateways, and routers. And then, of course, the computer system itself is seen as a set of interfaces. And anyway, there's some text below that describes all this. And gateways were, I guess, were tunnel terminations, right? So again, that's why they're called out separately.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
this,
the difference
the
here. Yeah, the difference here, Joe, would be when you talk about we have to redefine interface from this perspective, but this does give you a view. But I understand this view from what you're.
Yeah, this, well, and again, an interface is a logical interface. So
Yeah.
again, if you notice, I think I drew a thing where I have a port having, did I ever draw where a port has two interfaces? But in theory, you can have that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a port, a VLAN tag, a .br tag, you know, that can, those are all interfaces.
Right.
And it can, and effectively an interface is any place where you can select on a combination of packet fields appropriate to the layer being considered, and say, hey, that's a subset of traffic that I care to treat in a particular way. Again, so this is a somewhat abstract notion. And then if you take a simpler view, you know, this is your simpler view of how integrated routing and forwarding looks, right?
Yep.
This is a is a not as annoying view. And again, you can have, the interface can have VLAN 100, 200, 300, and that goes to 3 separate bridges, because really it's 3 separate sub interfaces at that point, 3 separate logical interfaces. And again, I could have drawn it all out in messy detail, but I drew it this way because the enumeration is just hard to show visually, which is part of why the discussions are so tricky, because it gets complicated fast. It's not intellectually challenging, but managing the scope gets complicated fast, as anybody who's worked in this stuff knows.
Right.
All right, any questions? I don't know if this is useful, but it was work that was done, I don't know, this was done 10 years ago.
So
About
it can
7
be
years
useful.
ago.
It can be useful.
Yeah, I can send this to you, Mark, and you can
Okay.
decide what to do with it. Because
Alright.
again, this was all put into public, so this is all out there somewhere, and buried in some redfish, meeting note back in the day. So, any
So
other questions? Again, I had a bunch of to-dos when we decided to pull the plug and write so what happened to this is we pulled the plug on this, and we decided instead to write a Yang translator to basically redfish. So Yang to redfish translator, and there's a whole spec on that. We basically mapped every element of Yang into the language redfish uses algorithmically. So we were able to, and then there were some contractors actually wrote a translator, and that's actually out there somewhere. I haven't been involved in this in a long time, but that's actually out there somewhere. Any questions? All right, so we'll turn you back to Mark's thread, but I'll send this to you, Mark, and you can,
Yeah.
parse through it and see if there's anything that helps, or if it just gives ideas. It was worth the time.
Well, it kind of aligns with this. This is what I was trying to get pulled up as one of the things. So if you look at it from the interface perspective, just from what you were talking about with VLANs, right? This is kind of taking OpenConfig and mapping the pieces out and then figuring out which ones actually apply. So if I look at the interface, as you map things out from a device perspective, whatever the DPU would be, you'd have interfaces. Network instances is where you start pulling in all the routing functionality, although they do have interface extensions that deal with VLAN, routed VLANs and tunnels and lags. But not to digress, if you look at the interfaces break into what they call sub interfaces, of which a VLAN is considered a sub interface type. But when you define it as an Ethernet interface, it also has a switched VLAN definition. So this is where I was saying it gets kind of convoluted, because it's extending the interface and sub interface characteristic within the OpenConfig model. And then of course it breaks down. The key components really come down to your ingress mapping, your egress mapping, as well as this definition of the tagging, which in a lot of cases when you're coming from an XPU, I don't yet see the need for double tagging support. It's probably just needing single tagging at this point. Now, if we do see the need for double tagging, we can add that in also. But this is kind of how I've started mapping out what the VLAN perspective would look like and how we can try to figure out how to map it into our protobufs within the framework that we're putting together. If you look at the framework, let me find the right one. That one. I have too many windows open here. Sorry, guys. So this is basically building up a protobuf definition. This is the open config interfaces where you have, this is one that we've already contributed to and put out there as a potential starting point, but you have to bring in an additional component called the tag, the TPID value. That's one of the additional components that you bring in. Now, the other thing that I've added in looking at this is there's an Ethernet proto that has to be built up, which talks about, the Ethernet information related to that interface port, but it also brings in the VLAN interface. And then of course the VLAN protobuf would then have whether you're native VLAN access or trunk types, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where I'm looking at how you would extend all of that information in the protobuf definitions to support just basic VLANs and access and VLAN trunks. And then from there, we can build up more. So that covers what I've been independently looking at versus, and I haven't put this out yet to the API group. This is something I want to finish up so I can put it out there and get feedback.
You should actually go look at what's in Redfish.
Yep. Oh, I need
Okay.
to look at what's in Redfish. I need to look at what's out in Netlink to make sure Netlink can tie this in correctly, because one of the interfaces that we'll have to tie into is the kernel Netlink. So, questions?
Yeah, and CSDL is the language we converted to. So OData. So there's an OData specification for laying out essentially schemas. And Redfish originally had adopted this OData CSDL language, but everything gets then converted into a JSON schema, which is why all you see is the JSON for the most part. We see both the CSDL and the JSON, but what gets used is the JSON. So that, and so that's it. And there is some networking model stuff there for tying the for anchoring the open config model set. Anyway, there's a notion of a network device that anchors the model set. So that might help inform. Again, that's what we ended up with. So what I just showed you is what I had proposed. That sort of got derailed, and we ended up with tying the open config models together in a notion of a network device. So that part of Redfish is worth looking at, and those specs are all open. Just as another set of background that might help with deciding what to do for networking. And I'm not suggesting we do either of the things I said, but any information you could go, oh yeah, I like this and I hated that part of it. So all right, any other discussion or questions? Okay, last agenda item is, let me get our notes back up, is who's going to go. So Dan, you're going to go next week. Who else wants to go with Dan on so we have for summary, Tim, do you guys want to give an update?
For next week?
Yeah, for next week or the week after. You can volunteer for the 10th as well, August 10th as well.
Oh, I think next week is fine. I don't think the update will be substantially different for the 10th. So.
Okay. All right. So we have our agenda for next week. How would you like me to describe your project? Give me 5 words or, 3 words or something.
It's an example, Nginx example deployment on DPU.
I like that phrasing. All right. And so, all right, so we have our agenda set for next week. Any other questions or comments? Or anything on the horizon that people are thinking about bringing in for either approval or, do we need to tackle this type discussions? And the very last big thing is we'll have to get back to the what is an OPI release discussion. In a couple, probably in a couple or 3 weeks, we ought to come back and go do another round on what is an OPI release. So you don't have to respond to that, but put your thinking hats on, because I'm going to need input from everyone, because that's going to start to be a thing we have to define and care about. All right. Thanks for your time, everyone. If you have any questions or comments that you were too shy to say on a recorded call, text me, or we'll set up a little quick session one-on-one and we'll discuss it. Thank you.